Hello and welcome to the Health Bridge podcast. I'm your host, Holly B, and I welcome you back to this series that Andrea Marshall and I are doing on cognitive biases. This is something that is simply part of human nature. It is something that we all fall, quote unquote, victim to, but there's nothing necessarily innately bad or wrong with cognitive bias. And as we've discussed in previous episodes, the biases are there for a reason. They're there to actually help us through our day. Cognitive biases are not inherently good or bad, they just are. They're really a clever hack that is part of our human nature to help us manage our lives on a day-to-day basis without having to overthink every single little thing that we do or say or decide on. And we've talked more about that in previous episodes, which I will have linked in the show notes. But just to reintroduce Andrea quickly, she is a project manager and positive psychology practitioner. She's a teacher, she's an avid learner, and she is very passionate about helping people flourish and helping projects succeed. Her mission is to provide business leaders and project professionals with the knowledge and skills necessary to support their own well being and the well being of others, to meaningfully engage stakeholders, and to lead thriving teams in service of improved business and project outcomes. As we continue our series here today, we will be talking about the continued influence effect. This one is, again, a very interesting one. It's a little bit more about actually how our memory works, how our brain actually functions, as opposed to, oh, it's just easier for me to believe one thing or another. So, Andrea will dive in to that and what it means in just a moment. I will be linking all of the previous episodes in the show notes, so make sure that you catch up on all of the different biases that we've talked about so far. And with that, enjoy this episode on continued influence effect. Andrea, welcome back for our next episode in our cognitive bias series that we're doing. We've been having a lot of fun so far. We've been able to poke fun at ourselves. We've been able to learn a lot, I think, with the biases that we've talked about previously. And today we're going to be talking about continued influence effect as far as it relates to bias and things that we get caught up in. So if you could introduce this new bias for us.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. It's great to be back. Yeah, continued influence effect is a really fun one because we can all probably think about experiences of this. So the continued influence effect is our tendency to believe previously learned misinformation, even after that information has been corrected. And it has to do with the way our brains work. So this one isn't quite so much the belief systems or value judgments. It's actually the way that our memory functions. And representations of both the old information can coexist in our brain, but the old information is more firmly embedded. And we've maybe been replaying that old information multiple times over a length of time. And so it's stronger within our neural networks than the new information. It's also the information that comes to mind most readily. So even if I have this old information and this new information, if I'm asked, it's the old information that will come up first. So continued influence effect plays out in a lot of different ways. And so that was a lot of information about this. So let's dig in a little bit.
Yeah, this is a really interesting one. And what I find most interesting is what you said about it being more about the way our memory works.
Mm-hmm.
So that feels good to know that it's not just us trying to hold on to things that we know aren't true. It's literally just ingrained in our system, right? Is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's really how working memory functions. So unlike us like when we talked about the ostrich effect, right? It was us wanting to hold on to our psychological view of the world and not come into conflict. This one is really much more around how we learn. And I think a really great example, and I'll bring it up first this time. I'm going to bring up COVID. It was a really great example of how this could play out. So as early on in the in COVID, there were advice to like wear masks or, oh, masks don't do any good or do this, don't do that. Information was changing so rapidly that oftentimes the first thing we heard was sort of what we held on to, or that thing that most strongly resonated with us was what we held on to. And we were getting new information quickly, but oftentimes it was poorly communicated. And so it didn't give us a way to sort of attach into working memory if it wasn't communicated well. And so we would hold on to those things that made sense versus those things that maybe weren't quite so understandable. And it created for most of us a little bit of chaos around the COVID information because the information wasn't linear. It wasn't super clear. It was changeable as different studies and different information was coming to us. And so many people would default to whatever made sense the most first through that. And it's even taken, we're still sort of analyzing and evaluating how all of that came out to get to a good, solid understanding.
Mm-hmm. The COVID scenario could happen again, right? So I think it's really important for us to be talking about this right now and
Mm-hmm.
having more of an understanding of how we as humans grasp this information when it's being thrown at us from so many different angles. When one outlet is saying, yes, this, and the other outlet is saying, no, that's bad information. This is the right information. And it's back and forth. People are getting canceled left and right. And you don't know what to believe. So it's good to understand how the brain functions with all of that and how we can take that information in and how to also analyze if we can take some of our emotions out of it, how to take a little step back and say, well, I'm grasping onto this information. This is what I'm believing right now. Is that still current?
Mm-hmm.
Is there other people saying something different that I should, going back to some of the other biases we've talked about with like confirmation bias, is there some other information that maybe I don't want to hear, but maybe I should at least entertain to decide which side I feel is true and right?
Yeah. And that's definitely, and this could play a lot with other sorts of biases, with where we tend to lean and where we believe. It can play out in some kind of interesting ways. So I have several examples and I thought I'd share them
Please share.
to help us kind of talk about how all of this can come about. One of the really interesting ways that this shows up has to do with false news stories, which with current social media, things that are really opinion can often look like news. And so that can be sort of interesting. It can also play out in the way that we interpret a particular piece of information. And so I'll share one of my own stories on this one that is a little silly, but shows how this works. I enjoy the music of the band, the Red Hot Chili Peppers. They're just a fun band. And I remember hearing a story once many years ago that their lead singer had overdosed. And I had interpreted that as meaning that he had died. And so I was under the belief that the lead singer was dead and they had replaced him and it was a different singer now in that band. And my husband and I, several years later, were having a conversation and I said, "Oh, didn't he die?" And my husband was like, "No, he didn't die." And I was like, "What?" And I was just so sure that this information was true. And it afterward, and eventually my husband did say, yes, he had a drug problem. He did overdose. He got sober. He's just fine now. He's also clean, and they are still the same band they always were. But I absolutely believed that was true. And there are times when I'll think about that story, and there's a little piece of me that has to remind myself, oh, yes, he did not die. That was not accurate information. But I believed that for a long time. And I think we see that a lot with both interpretation of the information that we get. It wasn't that what I heard, it wasn't that the story I received was wrong. It was that my interpretation of the story that I received was incorrect. And we can do that a lot in lots of different areas where somebody will share a piece of information and we place our own kind of definition into that information and we form knowledge in our own brain about that where it actually isn't correct. And it can take a little bit of doing. Like I needed evidence. Like even after my husband told me that, right? I was online and I was looking it up and I'm like, oh, okay. That's, it wasn't enough for my husband to tell me. I had to confirm that. And so that's just one sort of fun way that can show up.
Right. Yeah, that's funny. I think we think that we are understanding things correctly naturally, right?
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it's usually our own misinterpretation that causes the confusion. Another funny little story similar to yours is a chef friend that I have was researching kosher foods because she had to prepare something that was some parts of a meal that was kosher. And so she was doing her research and reading in, and she was telling myself and her husband about it. And we're like, that doesn't sound right. She's, no, that's what it is. Yeah, but I don't know. That doesn't sound quite right. So we did a little Googling and she had interpreted it opposite of what it,
Yeah.
I can't remember the exact thing that it was, but she read it to mean the opposite of what it actually meant. And luckily, we figured that out prior to her preparing any of these foods. But it's just so funny that we can just misread a sentence or mishear a sentence. And all of a sudden, we have a completely different understanding of what the truth actually is.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. And it can be significant. So, yeah, that's one way that this sort of bias, the continued influence effect can show up is through a misunderstanding in the way that knowledge has formed, right? And then, like you just saying, that doesn't seem right, right? Like you had to go look, you had to go verify.
Right.
Another place that it can happen or where it can embed is if we've held a misconception for a very long time and then years and years later, perhaps we hear the correct information or we get corrected information, that initial misconception can still influence our thinking. And, we talk a lot about nutrition when we have our chats. And I think back to when I was growing up and we didn't have a food pyramid, we had the 4 food groups. And even though I know that's no longer best information, and I know lots about what happened, the politics behind the 4 food groups and those various things, when I'm putting meals together, even now, I sometimes think about those 4 food groups and I'm like, wait, no, hold on. But it's such an embedded part of what was true for me for a good portion of my life before these sort of not the current knowledge shifted and changed and we came to know more. I think that, especially with health information, can be an area where this continued influence effect can really take a hold is knowledge changes over time. But if we formed a belief based on something we knew, and then we get this new information, it can be hard to bring that into our cognitive schema when it contradicts an existing belief.
Mhm. Let's talk about nutrition some more. Let's talk about fat Let's talk about cholesterol. When I was a kid and while you were growing up as well, the fat-free craze was going on,
That was
and
the
it
thing.
was, quote, unquote, "backed by science." Granted, we know now, because it's completely transparent at this point, that was completely bought and paid for by powers that be,
Mm-hmm.
that whole narrative, and statins are a huge moneymaker, and so there's a lot of influence there, but there's still so many people that grew up in that time period that are so still stuck on, "But fat's bad for you. Saturated fat is bad for you. Butter's bad for you." I grew up using margarine for the first huge portion of my life, and now I look back at that and I'm just like, "Oh my god." They were only doing what they knew at the time. My parents were only making those decisions based on the science that they had access to at the time. But the point being is that we know better now.
Mm-hmm.
The science is fully there to support the fact that cholesterol is not this big, bad, terrible thing. Um, and yet, some people still have that ingrained in them. Really quick, Holly B here. I just wanted to interrupt the podcast to ask you for a quick favor. Can you take just a moment to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you are listening in on? It makes a world of a difference. And the reach of this podcast, it takes like literally under 10 seconds. So go do that right now. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And now back to the episode.
There's still that belief. Yeah, cholesterol is a fun one because now, like, for so many years, at least of my life and probably yours as well, like cholesterol was just a thing, right? There was
Right.
cholesterol. And now there's like, when you get your blood test, there's these three different cholesterol numbers, and there's the good one and the bad one. And so it's a much more complicated type of consideration that this new information has brought to us. The old information was easy. Cholesterol.
Yes.
I even had that conversation not too long ago with a friend where we were talking about eggs, and they're like, well, "I should be eating egg whites, right?" I'm like, "Well,
Old news.
no, but if you want, that's just those things that are so pervasive." And in that example, the eggs example, that isn't something that they've even thought about since they probably learned, oh, egg yolks have cholesterol, and so I shouldn't be eating those. I'm like, well, there's, there's new information, and you're not eating that many eggs anyway. So,
Right.
and it's funny how those things can stick with us. And even though we hear otherwise, it's still sticky. Like that old information, it's been in the brain cells for a very long time. And we'll find ourselves having a conversation and sort of stop and like, well, is that right? Is eggs right? They're okay now. Like,
Right.
and so, yeah, because the information we have available to us changes over time. Science isn't absolute. Okay, laws of thermodynamics aside, we know so little about the body. We know so much, and yet we know so little, and we're constantly learning more. That the science evolves so much, and the way that we manage sort of the lobbying powers that be to reduce the amount of effect they might have on real information. Now, I think social media brings us a new form of kind of disinformation or influenced information that we maybe want to be aware of as we form these things, but they definitely can play a role. And so another one of those things, it's good to be aware of, right?
Mhm.
It's not going to go away. It's not bad or good. There's no judgment. Be aware that sometimes when you are facing these sorts of conversations, am I working with the right information, the newest information, or am I holding on to these old things?
Right. And just to touch on, because you brought up that social media can bring this other information to light that maybe isn't as factual, maybe is more opinion based. That's definitely true. But it can also be a way of accessing information that the other outlets have blocked, that don't want shared. So again, we have to step into all of this information that we've been discussing on all of these little episodes here on the biases, because we have to be, this is all to help us be more discerning, essentially, right?
Yeah.
So being able to learn how to question things and come to more informed decisions for ourselves.
Yeah, definitely. A couple of things about about the continued influence effect. So one of the things you'll hear with it is the term cognitive dissonance. And so when we encounter new information that contradicts an existing belief, it creates what's referred to as cognitive dissonance. And it's a state of sort of intellectual discomfort of it doesn't agree. I don't like, it's really easy to dismiss it out of hand. And so often choosing to maintain that original belief kind of resolves the cognitive dissonance piece of it. And yet this new information may actually be more accurate. So an interesting thing that can happen with that. And I think we've all experienced cognitive dissonance from time to time. The fat is such a great example of that. Oh, for so many years, I was told not to eat fat. And now, and yet you'll still hear people who are like watching, oh, is that fat free? Or is that, because we still hold that so closely in our belief system.
Right. Yeah. Years ago, gosh, probably, I don't know, 10 or so years ago, when I was working with a naturopath, and she put me on a high cholesterol diet intentionally. And I was sharing this with an older woman that I knew, who I loved and respected. And her immediate reaction is, oh dear, why would you do that? And I was like, because my body needs cholesterol and saturated fat to function and to create more hormone balance. I had to kind of explain to her, and she still is definitely not in acceptance of this information. Like, she was so tuned into the old narrative. And which, of course, knowing her as much as I did at the time, I could tell that tapped into other things of that era, of how women are supposed to look, and the whole narrative on that, down that road. But yeah, it was so interesting to me. I think I forget sometimes, because I tend to be very open to new information like this, and I actively seek it out, that other people aren't in that same awareness level as I am. And I forget sometimes.
But you probably created a little cognitive dissonance in her.
Yes. Yes,
She
exactly.
goes, oh no.
Right? Can't handle this information. I lived my whole life with the other information. Yeah. And such, again, is the human experience.
It really is. The other thing that can come up with this continued influence effect has to do with source credibility. If the source of the correction of the information isn't someone that we believe, maybe we have a cognitive bias against that particular source, we deem the source as unreliable, then the correction may not override we may hold on to our misinformation. And so if I held the belief that, I'll use an extreme example that isn't entirely accurate, but maybe useful for reference. If I held the belief that everything I read or that I see on Instagram is biased or is influenced and isn't 100% accurate, it's all opinion, then I may see information on Instagram that contradicts something I learned a long time ago. And I may just dismiss it out of hand because it was Instagram, right? Because of the vehicle by which this information came to me, where if I read it in the New York Times, or if I read it, or if it was through some news source that I deemed credible, I might be more open to it. And so that source credibility can play a big role into how willing we are to receive that new information that contradicts what our currently held belief is.
And it's not to make this a political discussion at all, but politics is a perfect example of that. If you hear a person from each party say the same thing, you're likely going to discredit it from the one that you don't believe in, and you're going to believe it from the one that you do believe in.
Mm-hmm.
You can't help yourself.
Just, it's that confirmation bias all over again, right?
Yes,
We're biased toward that source which we most believe in.
exactly. And we could go so down the rabbit hole with that one, but we'll leave politics at bay. We'll leave it at that.
That's probably best. The other thing that plays a role worth mentioning in this continued influence effect has to do with repetition. And this sort of can go back to the discussions around nutrition information we might have gotten in the 80s or 90s versus what we have available to us today. The more frequently the misinformation is encountered, the more likely it is to be believed and the harder it is to correct. It's one of those things that we often, and I hate to bring politics into it again, but we see it on both sides, right? That if we repeat the thing often enough, it becomes the truth, even if it's not the truth. And so often, if we're finding ourselves in that place of eggs are bad, egg yolks are bad, they have too much cholesterol, this, that, or fat is what makes you fat is what makes you, like, we get those repeated things, then it becomes much harder to correct those deeply held beliefs, even if it wasn't true in the first place. And becomes what we call illusion as truth.
And gosh, this can even go into mental health and childhood traumas, or just trauma from relationships that were unhealthy. Now somebody's consistently saying, "You're not smart. You're not smart. You're never going to figure that out. You're never going to make anything of yourself."
Yeah.
You know, that if that was ingrained in your head when you were a kid, how hard is that going to be to override and realize that's just somebody's opinion and it's not based in fact?
Yeah. Somebody else's narrative. And it's so, with those sorts of things, so often it can even be well-meaning, right? If I tell you, oh, you have to work harder, you're not as smart, so you're going to have to work harder than everybody else, right? They may be meant well, and
Right.
yet it really wasn't beneficial or helpful in the long run. And it can be really difficult to say, wait a minute, I have some evidence here that says otherwise. I think those sorts of things can happen a lot in our health journeys, where people are like, really? You believe that? Really? That doesn't seem like science. Science is a word that gets bandied about quite a lot in various contexts. And so looking at how we form those beliefs and what that new information is and where is it coming from can be really helpful. And again, I feel like we end every one of these conversations with, be curious, be interested in, gosh, why do I hold that belief? Is that a belief I hold? I wonder where that came from. Why am I so resistant to this new information?
I think especially there's power in, why am I resistant to this new information?
Yeah.
If you can dig deep into that, you're going to learn a lot about yourself.
Yeah, you are. And again, it's good to have some trusted advisors around you to help have those conversations. If it happens in the echo chamber of your own head, then it's pretty easy to just stay where you're at. So having somebody that you can trust to go to say, hey, I just heard that it's okay to eat eggs now. Is this true? Or I just heard whatever that case may be around so many different things that can influence how we make decisions about our health, about nutrition, about our well-being. I know for myself, one area that I found really fascinating was I read that they were training EMTs and medical workers on some basic Reiki practices. And I thought, well, how interesting that we're starting to train first responders to help calm and soothe a person who's in trauma, and yet so very contradictory to what a lot of us might have heard growing up around energy work or breath work or other sorts of non-traditional practices. I think it says our world is coming along. We've come a long way. We still have far to go.
Absolutely. And again, just to bring it full circle, the more awareness we create in our own lives around these biases, the further we can come along.
Absolutely.
The more change we can create in the world.
Yes. And conversations like this, right, are how we do that. Start to become aware and go, interesting.
Thank you, Andrea. This has been another really fun conversation, and I look forward to the next episode in this series.
Yeah, me too. Thanks so much, Holly.
The funny thing about the continued influence effect is that we don't always realize when we are stuck in this bias, right? Because we're so sure and convinced of our own knowledge that we don't realize that it may have actually shifted, that the information currently might have changed. If you are aware of an instance of changing information in your life where you're still stuck on the old narrative, the old information, I would love to hear about it. Reach out to Andrea, reach out to myself, and let us know. Just shoot us a little message. We would love to hear you chime in on this conversation. And we will again be continuing this series on cognitive biases. And we hope that you are learning a lot about yourself, the way you function in the world, and creating more awareness in your day-to-day life because of this. We will see you soon on the next mini episode in this series in the next few weeks. Thanks so much for listening.